Heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of Truth, who art in all places and fillest all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us, cleanse us from every stain, and save our souls, O gracious Lord. Amen.
Amen.
So, we're not going to have to do a ton of review this time because we're really kind of technically last month we started the story of Abraham, but all I basically did last month was ramble on and on about the history of ancient Sumeria in particular and Mesopotamia in general. And
we're Orthodox, though. We love to ramble about Mesopotamia.
Yeah. This is a little more ancient than most Orthodox rambles by a couple thousand years. But so I won't now repeat the introduction again. This time we're really going to be picking up. We did talk a little bit about, and so I'll review this quickly, the very end of Genesis chapter 11, because the story of Abraham proper in the book of Genesis really picks up at the beginning of Genesis 12, which is where we're starting tonight. But there is a little bit of genealogical material at the end of Genesis 11 that relates to Abraham that we talked about last time. And we could do that really quickly because basically it gives the genealogy from Shem, the son of Noah, to Abraham. Actually, technically to Abraham's father, Terah, but then it lists Terah's three sons, and it lists Abram and Lot and the other figures of Abraham's family who are going to play into the story that we're going to begin to read tonight in Genesis 12. And it's important to note that the first part of Genesis 11, as we reviewed last time, and we'll be talking about a little again this time, though not hopefully just retreading the same exact points, was the story of the Tower of Babel. And so when we get to that second part of Genesis chapter 11, it doesn't give us a genealogy from the Tower of Babel to Abram. It gives us a genealogy. It goes back to the flood from Genesis 6 through 9 and goes from there. And the reason that's important is that, as we're going to see when we pick up here in a couple of minutes at the beginning of Genesis chapter 12, it just picks up with Abraham. There is no indication here as we start reading about Abram that any specific amount of time has passed since the Tower of Babel. It's not clear of any events that may have happened in between that are of some significance to Abram's story. We really have a cold open at the beginning of Genesis chapter 12. So we're expected to sort of read this in sort of direct continuity with that story. Also significant, and we'll be talking about this more as we get into chapter 12, is the way in which the story of Terah, Abram's father, was told at the end of that genealogy, which is essentially the way that genealogy ends. Terah was called to take his family, including Abram and his two brothers, Lot, his nephew, to take his whole family and leave Ur and travel to Canaan. But we're told that Terah traveled with his family as far as Haran and then stopped there and remained there until he died. And so we're going to see, as we pick up now with the story of Abram in chapter 12, that in certain ways the beginning of Abram's story is going to sort of overlap with that brief little information about his father, but be told from a very different angle. And we commented last time that the significance of his father stopping in Haran is that Haran was another city dedicated to the same Mesopotamian moon god as Ur, as the city they were leaving. And this isn't just something we find out from archaeology, but this is something that gets elaborated actually later in the scriptures. At the end of the book of Joshua, when Joshua, after leading the conquest of Canaan, is sort of giving his final sermon, his final speech to the Israelite people at the end of the conquest, he goes back to Abram and Abraham. And the reason for that is that he wants to talk about the promises regarding the land that were made to him that have now been fulfilled. But in the midst of that, he talks about Abram leaving Ur to come to Canaan. And when he does, he mentions that Abram's forefathers, and therefore the forefathers of the Israelites he's speaking to, were pagans, were idolaters, were worshiping other gods when they were in Ur, when they were in Mesopotamia. And he makes a specific point to say, including Terah, Abraham's father, right? So Joshua there shows that this isn't just an obscure archaeological detail, that Ur and Haran happen to be dedicated to the same moon god, but that Terah himself apparently was a worshiper of this moon god rather than Yahweh, the Most High God, who we're going to see interacting with Abraham as we pick up tonight. And so his declining to come to Canaan was very much related to his devotion to that pagan god. So that I think will suffice for a sort of brief recap of the little bit. We only read a little bit of text last time after my long rambly introduction. And so unless there are any other leftover questions or comments or late breaking sports scores, we'll go ahead and pick up in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1.
I don't have any sports scores, but just a little question here about like recordings, because it's my first time tuning in live. I've listened to some of your recorded verse by verse talks. Do you have these anywhere so I could maybe listen to the recap? Because I do love long rambling talks about Mesopotamia.
Yeah, these are all recorded on YouTube.
Awesome.
They're posted on YouTube. So
on your official channel there.
On if you go to the Amen DOMSE channel,
Gotcha.
that's where they're actually posted. And I've also, if you go to my YouTube channel, I have a playlist of all of them there.
Oh, nice. I do love playlists.
Yeah.
See, this is why I should pay more attention when Michael so kindly posts the fact that you have the recordings. I'm sure he's mentioned it many times. Thank you, Father.
All right. So Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your kindred, and from your father's house, to a land I will show you." So we'll stop right there. So notice when I said it was a cold open, I wasn't kidding, right? Like there's no sort of segue or setup. We're only told later how old Abram is. We're only, there's all kinds of information to come about who Abram is, more about his family, more about his wife, all these sort of things. But when his story begins, it just begins with, and the Lord there is the name Yahweh, is Yahweh the Most High God just says this to Abram. He just talks to him. And that's how we begin. So that's important for a few reasons. It shows us a few things. One of the first things to notice there is we can see when we compare this to other figures in Genesis and in the rest of the Torah and the rest of the Old Testament. When someone first encounters God, there's a pattern that tends to follow, right? one of the most well-known ones may be right with Moses, where Moses asks him who he is and what his name is, right? There's who are you? And even with Jacob, 2 generations later, when he wrestles with God, he wants to know his name, he wants to know who he is, right? There's this sort of incomprehension, or people sort of panic and fall on their face and think that they're going to die. This is a sort of stark contrast from that. So not only does Abram not ask God who he is, God doesn't tell him, right? So he doesn't come and introduce himself here, nor does Abram ask who he is, which therefore allows us to conclude that this represents an already existing relationship, right? The reason God didn't have to introduce himself is that Abram already knew who he was. That's also why Abram then didn't have to ask. So this conversation that we're seeing here is not just out of the blue. Abram's walking around one day in Ur, kicking a rock and minding his own business, and all of a sudden he hears the voice of God, the creator of the universe. This is an ongoing relationship, and so this is just an instance of God once again speaking to him and telling him to do this. And that's especially important, not just for what it tells us about Abraham. Here now he's still Abram, but also in contrast to, and I mentioned this would be coming up again, what just happened in the Tower of Babel story. So we talked about in the review last time that in the Tower of Babel story, after the flood, in which mankind became so wicked that sort of the presence of God itself, God's holiness, sort of wiped out nearly all of humanity. And then after that event, God took and placed his bow in the clouds. We talked about how the rainbow is not a bow like you tie on a package, it's pretty, look, it's colors, but it's the word bow like a bow and arrow. And so this is God setting down his bow, which is representative of him no longer being at war with humanity. And that's when he makes the promise, when he sets down his weapon, he makes the promise, I will no longer make war against humanity. I will never again destroy the earth with a flood. But then what we see as we move through Genesis chapters 10 and into chapter 11 is that things on earth very quickly start getting just as bad once again as they were before the flood. So we have Nimrod here, who's kind of this Nephilim figure who shows up. We have the Tower of Babel being constructed and idolatry and everything that goes with that. And so God keeps his promise, and rather than remaining with humanity and having them perish from his holiness in their wickedness, he instead retreats. And we talked about how in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, it gives more detail about this, and also in Deuteronomy 4, that God sort of, because he has to distance himself, he then assigns angelic beings as sort of intermediaries between himself and humanity to protect humanity from his holiness. And this is reflected throughout the rest of Scripture in a bunch of ways. This is why in the New Testament, we see these comments about the law being given by angels, even though you don't really see anything about that in Exodus, right? It's because of this understanding that it's always through intermediaries until we get to Christ and things change, for the sake of protecting humans from God's holiness in our sinfulness. So what happens after that then is that the nations begin to worship those angelic beings as gods. That's where the quote unquote gods of the nations. This is why the Psalm says all the gods of the nations are demons. This is why St. Paul says that what the pagans sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons because of this understanding. So all of that is to say, the fact that Abram already has this pre-existing relationship with Yahweh, who is the Most High God, still, unlike his father, who is worshiping this pagan god, this false god, this demonic spirit, unlike everyone else in his city, as far as we know, who is worshiping demonic spirits, Abram is not. So Abram is one of these few people. We're going to meet a couple more before his story is through. But there are people, there are still faithful people, even in this situation following the Tower of Babel. There are still scattered faithful people who still remember Yahweh, the Creator, who still are worshiping him, who are still faithful and loyal to him, and have not gone off after pagan gods or other things of man's devising. So Abram is one of these people, and that's one of the things that's being communicated right off the bat here at the very beginning, that the fact that he has this communication already established with God, this relationship of faithfulness. And what we're going to see is that there's not going to be a point in Abram's story where God is going to come and say, okay, so here's what you need to do to get saved. Because that kind of idea is not in picture here, right? There's never going to be anything added to this relationship, right? God's never going to say, oh, by the way, now you also need to jump through these hoops, right? Now you need to do these things. Abram's relationship with his Creator is now here at the beginning of his story, and will be throughout his story, based just entirely on him living a life of faithfulness to his Creator, to God. This relationship that's already established, it continuing. And when it gets broken, Abram repenting and doing what he needs to do to fix it, right? And Abram continuing throughout his life to draw closer to God, to his Creator, and to come to know him more deeply, right? That is the pattern of Abram's life.
I have a question.
And the reason I'm making a big point about this now is that this is exactly the aspect of Abram's life that St. Paul is going to pick up on in the New Testament, right? That St. Paul, and this, unfortunately for us, who are primarily English speakers, who have had all of our English Bible translations, especially of St. Paul, done by Christians of a certain type, where St. Paul is talking about it gets translated as faith, not as faithfulness. And sometimes it gets translated as belief, even though it's the same word, translated two different ways. And that can cause us to develop the idea that what St. Paul is saying is that the basis of us sharing God's life, the basis of us coming to know him more deeply, has to do with something we think in our head, having some correct opinion about him. And what that does, you can see immediately, is if we try to understand it that way, if we try to take that understanding of St. Paul, which is kind of foreign to St. Paul, and then use St. Paul to read that back into Abram, it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Because again, what do we see here from the first verse? Abram is not someone who thinks the correct things about God, right? We don't see here that, well, all of these other folks around Abram are polytheists, and Abram is a monotheist. He has the opinion that there's only one God, and so that makes him different, better, more righteous, whatever, than everybody else. right? As far as we know, his father Terah only worshipped one God. The problem is it was the wrong one. It was a pagan god, not the true God. So we have to, and I wanted to make this overall point, whenever we're reading the New Testament, especially when we're reading St. Paul, we need to read him forward, right? So that means when St. Paul points us to Abram and later Abraham, he's pointing us to the person we actually meet in the book of Genesis and what the book of Genesis actually says about him. St. Paul is not going back and reinterpreting and changing the story. St. Paul is not telling us, well, this is the real way to read it that no one has known until St. Paul saw it in a vision. That's not what St. Paul is doing. St. Paul is using Abraham and who Abraham is as he's presented in Genesis to talk to us more about who Christ is and how we find our salvation. And so basically the point I was making at the beginning of this is what I believe is the point St. Paul is making in all of this when he talks about salvation being by faithfulness and not by works of the Torah, works of the law that come later through Moses, is he's just saying precisely this, that Abram was completely faithful to the one true God, to Yahweh, the God of Israel, who, even though Israel hadn't been born yet, so Yahweh, the Most High God, and lived a life of faithfulness. And that faithfulness expresses itself in a whole bunch of different ways. That faithfulness expresses itself in what Abram thinks, obviously, and what his opinions are, but it also expresses itself in what he does, right? So when, as we see here, and we're going to see going forward tonight, when Yahweh, the Most High God, the creator of heaven and earth, says to Abram, whom he already has this relationship with, go and take your family and move to the other side of the known world, Abram does it, right? And doing that was a lot of work, but that wasn't, as opposed to being faithful or thinking the right things, that was part and parcel of being faithful. It's part and parcel of being faithful was doing what God directed him to do. So I think Alex has a question.
Yes, thank you, Father. I had a thought while you were talking about Abram and Abraham's sort of reconciliation to God and how that's a defining narrative in his life. And I know in the New Testament is commonly seen as like this act of reconciliation where God sends down his only begotten son, Jesus, and Jesus essentially opens up the pathway for us to no longer be at enmity with God. But it occurs to me that all the holy people of the Old Testament were called like friends of God, for example, and Adam would be the first friend of God. And so I guess with his disobedience and Eve's disobedience and sort of the fall, that creates this enmity. And then not only the New Testament, but also the entirety of the Old Testament, like all the covenants are working towards reconciling man to God. And like you were saying, like God is never so offended by our uncleanness that he's driven away. It's rather that out of mercy, he removes himself so that his holiness doesn't destroy us. And so it's just a gradual process of God working with our free will to work out the best sort of salvation. And what that really looks like is being reconciled so that we can be friends with God again. That just never really occurred to me because of that heresy that, you know, the Old Testament God is angry and how that's imprinted itself on the culture where he's punishing and mad, and then Christ is this different God who's loving and kind and forgiving, but they're the same God. It's always Yahweh.
Right. Yeah. And because of that, I think enmity might even be too strong a word, because that kind of implies that we and God are enemies, and that's sort of the opposite of what we see. Right. The whole point is that God still loves us. Right. We're the
ones with the enmity.
Enemies. That's why he does all of the things he does. Right. He expels Adam and Eve from paradise because that is what is best for them at that point. Right, because they would either perish from his holiness or they would live forever wicked, right? Which would mean essentially they'd be like demons, you know, who are eternal and wicked. Um, and after the flood, as I was just mentioning, when he says, this is, and so he departs in order to, and the whole system of that does get added in the Torah through Moses later. That is all this highly developed sort of sin management system to allow God to live in the presence of his people, because he wants to. He wants to share his life with them. He wants to be their God. He wants them to be his people, but they're wicked. And so that puts them at danger, being in the presence of his holiness. And so he establishes the purification rituals and the sacrifices and all of these things in order to purify them from their sin over and over and over again, so that they can live in his presence. And so what changes when we get to Christ is that problem that was sort of being managed in the Old Testament is finally taken care of in Christ once and for all. And it goes from being about this little camp in the wilderness or this little parcel of land in Palestine to being about the whole world. So it gets bigger, and the problem really gets dealt with instead of just being managed. And really what we have here with Abram being called is sort of the beginning of that plan, because we have these three problems. We've had so far in Genesis leading up to this, we've had the expulsion from paradise, we've had the flood, we've had the Tower of Babel. So we've had these sort of three catastrophes in a row, and man is in this sorry state. And so these words we read in Genesis 12 verse 1 directed at Abram are the beginning now of God enacting his plan that's going to lead in that direction. So this is the first step in that road we just super briefly described. Chapter 12, Genesis chapter 12, verse 2. We made it through a whole verse in half an hour. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and in you all the tribes of the earth shall be blessed. So part one is you need to pick up your family and move to the other side of the known world. And then part two is then what God is going to do for him once he's there. And again, this is out of God's love, right? This is out of God's love. And so he says that he's going to make from him a great nation, and that through him, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And we're going to see this is the first statement of the promises to Abraham. As we go over the coming months, we're going to see God comes back and reiterates these promises over and over again. And each time sort of some more details are added that give us a bigger part of the picture. But I'm going to confine it to what we just had here for now, and we'll see how that gets more detailed and expands a little later on as we go on. But first, so he says a mighty nation is going to come from him. So there's going to be one particular nation that's going to come from him, but also then through him and through that nation, all the nations of the world are going to be blessed. So those two kind of go together. So, well, I'll add the middle part. And then in between those two, he said that he would bless those who bless Abram and curse those who curse Abram. What is that about? Well, that's Yahweh, the creator of the universe, saying that he is going to be Abram's God. This is the beginning of him being known as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right now, Isaac and Jacob aren't in the picture yet. It's Abraham. But this is significant because this would be in contrast to the gods of the nations, the pagan gods with whom Abram would have been otherwise familiar as a Mesopotamian in the 3rd millennium BC. So those gods were the gods of particular places, particular regions, sometimes of geographical features. They were spirits of a particular woods, or spirits of a cave, or spirits of a river. In other cases, it was territory, right? It was this city, or the area around this city, or these cities and the land around them. But it was always oriented toward this God was a spirit that had control, that had power, that had dominion over this area, right? Over this area. And that is not the picture here that we're given of Yahweh. Now, we've already been told in the book of Genesis leading up to this that Yahweh is the creator of heaven and earth. So technically, all the territory, all the land, all the geographical features, all of that belongs to him. But here, he is saying he is going to be the God of a particular person. And every time that is reiterated throughout the Old Testament, when he identifies himself as the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, he is placing his identity in terms of those particular people. So again, what does that mean? Well, that changes the nature then of what it means for him to be God. So in one sense, Yahweh as creator is the God of the entire universe. He is the most high God. He is the God of gods, right? The pagan gods, the demonic powers who are ruling over the pagan nations, he's their God, right? So he is everyone and everything's God in that sense, right? In that sense, in the sense of his dominion and his power and his authority. He's the Almighty, the all-powerful. But then in another sense, he is the God of particular people, in the sense that then there is a relationship that those people have with him that is of a different sort, right? That is of a different sort. So there were individual people in pagan nations who would be identified with one of the gods, but those would be usually the king. And the way they were identified with was not, oh, well, the God that we worship is the God of the king in a special way. You see a little bit of that later on in Israel, right? Where sometimes the king of Israel is referred to as the son of God in a certain sense, right? To reflect that relationship. Oh, he has a special relationship with our God. But in the pagan nations, it's because they believe the king was himself a god, either one of the gods in a group of gods, or that he was a sort of embodiment of one of the gods on earth, and therefore should be worshipped as a god, right? So there is nothing in this implying, of course, that Abram is himself a god. So this is a very different type of relationship. As I've said before, there weren't pagans going around in the ancient world singing "What a Friend We Have in Zeus," right? You weren't Zeus's pal. You weren't his friend. Zeus didn't love you, at least not in any way you'd want. If he did show up, that was usually bad news in Greek mythology, because Zeus needed to get me too'd really badly in the ancient Greek stories. And so you really didn't want his attention that much, right? But there was no concept of the kind of relationship we see here, right? Where a regular person would talk to their God in this way and be spoken back to, right? Rituals were done to appease certain gods. Rituals were done to ward off certain other gods whose attention you didn't want, and spirits, evil spirits. But there was not this kind of personal contact. And certainly none of those gods would choose to identify themselves with a particular human, right? Especially in the case of the Mesopotamian gods. In most of the Mesopotamian versions of the flood story that we have, the gods wipe out humanity for causing too much noise or otherwise generally being annoying. And so they just kind of get tired of them and annoyed by humans and stomp them out the way you'd stomp on an anthill, right? They're not going to come and identify themselves with one of those ants, right? And say, this ant is like a son to me. This ant is like part of my family. I want to share my life with this ant. That doesn't happen. But even though Yahweh, the God who created heaven and earth, is far more exalted than any of those pagan gods, he does come and identify himself with this person, Abram, because Abram has been loyal and faithful to him in return. And so there is a mutuality of this relationship. It's not just about Abram being faithful and loyal, and that's the one thing you need to do to get saved. It's about Abram being faithful and loyal to the God who knows him and created him and loves him, and who is faithful to him also, and who now makes promises to him that because he is faithful and true, he will most assuredly keep, even though it's going to take centuries for most of those promises to find any kind of visible fulfillment. So this is, as I said, this is the first time. We're going to come back to these promises, as I said, as we keep going. But this is the first time. And the key is that the key elements that we have introduced here are those two, that he is going to be the God of Abraham. He is identifying himself with Abram, not with the land he's going to, not with some other piece of land, not even with all the land entirely, but with Abram. And this promise that he's going to make a nation from him, and then through that nation, all the nations of the world will be blessed. We've just come from the Tower of Babel, where those nations have been divided and scattered, right? So God is saying to Abram that it's through Abram, through what he's starting here with Abram, that's going to start being reversed, right? These three catastrophes we've seen, starting with the last one and working our way back, are now going to be reversed and repaired through what God is going to do with and through Abram. So verse 4, then Abram departed as the Lord said to him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So we're told here that he departs from Haran at this point. So we think of, and the way it's later going to be described in the Old Testament, is that Abram is called out of Ur of the Chaldees. So you may even have had in your head the picture that Abram is in Ur, God comes and calls him, and then he leaves straight from there to go to Canaan. But actually what we see here at the end of chapter 11 and now here is that it seems like this was actually communicated. We don't know how it was communicated because we're not told, but this was actually communicated to Terah, to Abram's father, and Abram's father failed to do it. Abram's father only went as far as Haran. And so it's when Abram's father, Terah, then dies in Haran. When he dies, now Abram is the head of the household, the larger household, which includes his younger brothers, includes his nephew Lot, includes all of these other folks, that God says to him, you go, and Abram immediately goes. So there is also here, beyond just the two cities and this idea that Terah was a pagan and Abram was faithful to the Most High God, there is also this accentuation of Abram's faithfulness, right? Because it's contrasted immediately with Terah's unfaithfulness. The fact that Terah doesn't complete it, doesn't do it, doesn't follow through, whereas Abram, once he's in the position of authority, he does. So that contrast is actually brought out here. But people don't read genealogies because they're boring. So that usually gets skipped, and we don't notice the Terah part. But so we see when they set out, Abram is already 75 years old. So he is not by any means a young man. He has, as we said last time, lived a very full life already that we know basically nothing about from the scriptures before his story really starts. So his story starts as a 75-year-old. So for any older folks listening, this is a pretty baseline application, but it's true that God can start using you and start working in you and with you and through you at any point. It's not too late. With Abram, it starts at age 75 and goes from there. So don't ever think that if you wasted your youth like most of us do, and even if you wasted your middle age, there is still plenty of time to come to know God more deeply. Verse 5, so Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions, and every soul they acquired in Haran, and they departed for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land of the place of Shechem as far as the oak of Moreh, and the Canaanites were then in the land. So I'm not, you could tell I'm used to reading this in the King James and not the Orthodox Study Bible. Some of the names are a little different. But so we have here now Abram's wife, Sarai, his nephew, Lot. These are going to be the main characters that we're going to see now going forward. Abram's name, just as a reminder, I think we talked about this last time, but Avram means mighty father. This is probably not that when he was born, Terah named Abram that in the hopes of blessing him. Oh, someday my son will be a mighty father. It's more likely that he named him that referring to himself. And this is a very common thing. It's all through the Old Testament, where someone will give their child a name that is basically them congratulating and praising themselves. One of the most famous examples is Gideon in the book of Judges. There's this scene where some of the other Israelites come to him and accuse Gideon of trying to set himself up as king of Israel. They say, oh, you're trying to make yourself a king. How dare you try to make yourself a king? And Gideon sort of protests and says, what are you talking about? I'm not trying to make myself a king. How am I trying to make myself a king? Right? What are you talking about? And it says, and Gideon's son Abimelech was there. And if you know a little of any Semitic language, you might know that Avimelech means my father is king. Right? So he named his son my father is king, and all these people were like, hey, why are you trying to call yourself a king? And he's like, what are you talking about? That's just, I gotta have a baby name book. So this is probably a similar thing here with Avram. And Sarai, which is, we know later she's going to become known as Sarah when the name changes happen, and we'll get there. But Sarai means princess, essentially, which is sort of a nice name. I mean, we probably wouldn't actually name a daughter princess in English. There are a lot of fathers who may call their daughters princess. One of them may be my father-in-law calling my wife that, but you didn't hear that from me. But this is actually her original name. But so they set off, and we're told they take all the possessions, the whole household with them. So they go from living in a city, right, which is one type of life, obviously, to essentially forming a caravan. Abram's going to live the rest of his life basically as a nomad now. So they've got all of the family members, the big extended family. They've also got all kinds of hired men and hired servants. They've also got all kinds of indentured servants or slaves. They've also got livestock, and they're going to be traveling and living in tents. And that's how they make this journey. And then that's how they live when they get to the land of Canaan. This oak that's mentioned here is used repeatedly over the next few chapters as the place where Abram is camping and where he's living. And it's worth noting because when they say, oh, well, where's he camped? He's not near any cities. They can't say, oh, he was camped near Jericho, or he was camped near this city or that city. Later on, we're going to see Lot going and hanging around Sodom. But Abram, when they say where he's camped next to this ancient oak tree. That's the nearest sort of landmark or anything to point to. So he is now coming out of a city to live out on the plain as a nomad, out in the open areas, in the open land. And so his location is just given as next to this oak. Verse 7. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your seed I will give this land. And there Abram built an altar to the Lord who appeared to him. So we'll pause there again. So note here, it's not explicit back in 12 verse 1 in what way this particular episode in the relationship between Yahweh and Abram took place, right? It just says that he said this to him, right? So while I have my suspicions and there are arguments I would make, you can't prove just from the text that it wasn't sort of a voice, a disembodied voice. But here it's very explicit. Here it's very explicit. It says that Yahweh appeared to him. And this isn't going to be the last time. And from the fact that Abram doesn't have any kind of super radical reaction, he doesn't freak out, again, doesn't ask who he is. This is not something bizarre for Abram, right? That again, he's had this relationship with God all along. And so it's certainly a special thing when God appears to him, such that he builds an altar there and offers sacrifice. But and that means a number of things. That means Abram saw that, well, now this place is holy because this is a place where I've seen and encountered God. It also means that in the sacrifice, he's having a meal of thanksgiving with his household, which also involves God. The portions that are burnt are being offered to God. But so this is most definitely an appearance, and very clearly in the text. And this is, as I said, it's not going to be the last time in which Abram is going to walk and talk and speak to and see Yahweh, the Most High God, directly. But again, we see the directness here of their relationship. This is also the first of this is kind of a side note, but hey, nerds watch this too. So this is actually the first of 12 altars that are going to be built over the course of the book of Genesis. And if you look at the territory of the 12 tribes later in the Torah, there is one of these altars from the patriarchs, from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, from their lives. There is one altar from each of the 12 in each of the tribes' territories. And now here already, he kind of adds to the promise in that he adds this second element, right? He says, to your seed, to your descendants, I will give this land. A couple things about this. So the first one is the fact that the word seed is used here, and seed is going to be used a lot in terms of when this promise is reiterated later on, but the fact that seed is used here is different from what we saw back in 12 verses 2 through 4. In that first promise, it just said he would make a nation from him. That doesn't necessarily mean his direct bodily descendants, right? Because of course, he's the head of this big household, which includes his nephew, right? His other brothers and their children, some of whom are going to show up later in the story. So he has this big extended family that could have just meant, right, that what is now a big extended family in Abram's day that he's the head of is going to grow until it becomes a nation, right? It could have been understood that way. And that then through that nation, all the other nations will be blessed. But the fact that seed is used here, this is a very literal, the word used is the word that's used both in Hebrew and Greek for male gametocytes, right? So for male reproductive processes. So this is very directly saying your children, the children of your body, right? Your descendants. Notice again, he's now over 75. He's now in his late 70s and has no children as of yet, but God says this. So that's a major change. And now this is going to get elaborated on more as we go forward through the story of Abram, how that's going to happen and what that means. The other thing is that the word seed in Hebrew, zerah, is ambiguous in that it is a collective noun, meaning it's like fish or deer in English, where it could be singular or plural, like the same form. And so since it could be singular or plural in any given place, sometimes it's difficult to tell, right? And so this first mention, we really can't tell. It could be read either way. This could be read, I will give to your seed singular. I will give to some descendant of yours this land. Or it could be, I will give to your seed plural. I will give to your descendants this land. Now, in this case, for reasons we're going to see later, it is most likely meant to be plural here. But as these promises are given to Abram, and I just want to introduce this idea so it's out there and we're thinking about it, this promise is going to be used both ways. There's going to be seed plural. He's going to have descendants, right, as in the nation of Israel. But there are also going to be places where it's very clear that he's speaking in the singular of one particular seed, of one particular descendant. Then the second piece that's added here, of course, is the land in particular. While in the previous promise at the beginning of the chapter, God told Abram to take the big extended family to that land, he didn't explicitly say, this is the land where that nation is going to live. So this is sort of a little clarification, shall we say, of the reason you came here is that this land is going to be given to them. And again, this is going to be reiterated and elaborated on. We'll be coming back to this and going into more detail of exactly what that means and how that works. And I see a question in the chat if any of these altars, any of these 12 altars still exist, and the answer is no. And there aren't even any, to my knowledge, there aren't even any claimants who claim they're one of the original. Yeah, I don't think, even in the places, like for example, we've identified, there is an oak tree that is traditionally the oak of Mamre or the oak of Moreh here. But I don't believe there's anything next to it that they claim is the original altar. Someone could correct me on that. But I don't believe that to be the case. Okay. So he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south. So here's altar number 2, right? And again, he's out in the open country. So we're just told, well, he's in between these two cities. And if you go and look up an Old Testament Bible map, you'll see these two cities are pretty far apart. So he's somewhere in the open country between the two of them. But here again, when they make camp, he builds an altar, calling upon the name of Yahweh, is the way in which worship is most commonly referred to in the book of Genesis and several other parts of the Old Testament, but especially in the book of Genesis, it is calling upon the name of Yahweh. I'm going to wait on the digression I was about to go on. See, there's a circumlocution there in the sense that why isn't it just there he called upon Yahweh? There he called upon God, right? There he called upon Yahweh, the creator. Why is it there he called upon the name of Yahweh? But we'll talk about that more. There's a particular episode later on where we'll go into more depth on that, but I'll lay that tease there for people to think about. And then he continues on in his journey. He doesn't, when you get to this area between Bethel and Ai, there's not much of Canaan left, right? So the idea here, when it says he kept going south, is that he got to Canaan, he establishes these altars, but he doesn't stay there, he keeps going. So now verse 10, now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. So it came to pass when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarai his wife, indeed, I know you are a beautiful woman. Therefore it will happen when the Egyptians see you, so they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Therefore say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and I may live because of you. So this is the first time I mentioned that there were times where Abram's relationship with God was going to get a little rocky. This is one of the first places, and this should be telling. Just the first phrase, that there's a famine in Canaan. God told Abram and his family to go there, to take the whole household there. And so while they're there, there's a drought and a famine. Rather than Abram calling upon Yahweh, who he has this relationship, trusting in him, remaining loyal and faithful to him, to preserve him, he heads to Egypt. He heads back to civilization. He heads to a pagan civilization like the one God had called him out of, because he believes that there he's going to be safe. But even that, right, already now, as he's on his way there, he finds himself questioning that. Well, am I really going to be safe in civilization? Right? Because I've got my wife with me. She's beautiful, right? Somebody's going to try and kill. I'm just a wanderer. I'm a stranger, right? They've got a whole civilization on their side. They're going to kill me and take her. Right? So we can't say she's my wife. Now, rather than this being like, oh, wait, I'm not safe because civilization, right? The opposite, right? Civilization is part of the problem. These civilizations are filled with violence and sin and wickedness. This is what God called me out of. I need to trust him. He just comes up with a plan, right? Oh, well, say you're my sister, and then they won't have to kill me if they're interested in you, right? So that's his plan, and he goes ahead and goes to Egypt anyway. Verse 14, so it was when Abram came into Egypt, the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. Now keep in mind, Sarai is about 10 years younger, we're going to find out, than Abram. And Abram is at least in his late 70s. So she's in her late 60s. And there wasn't any plastic surgery or anything going around back then. So the fact that she is apparently a very impressive woman, even at that old age, is what the text is telling us. And that would be a little unexpected, even in that time. Verse 15, the princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh. Then the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. Now he treated Abram well for her sake and gave him sheep, oxen, donkeys, male and female servants, mules, and camels. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. I'll just continue. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now, therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go your way. So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning Abram, and they sent him away with his wife and all he had. So that brings us to the end of chapter 12. But so she's apparently so beautiful that Pharaoh's even interested in her and potentially making her one of his wives, because of course Pharaoh had a bunch. And this was a period of time at the end of the second millennium BC. You've probably heard about in ancient Egypt, pharaohs not wanting to marry outside their families. That wasn't true all the way through. And you have to remember that there was polygamy and harems and all of that sort of thing anyway. But so Pharaoh is so interested in Sarah, he's thinking about making her one of his wives. And so, oh, hey, her brother's here, right? All these nice things for her brother, right? So gives Abram slaves, gives him livestock and cattle and oxen, gives him all these things. So Abram seems to be making out okay on this, right? Well, what's the obvious problem here? Well, the obvious problem here is that while Abram is getting this material wealth here, as he's now gone back to civilization, he's given his wife over to a pagan king. And he's not defending her or her honor or caring for her as he should. He's not treating her as a princess, right? While Pharaoh and the Egyptians apparently see great value in her, it's unclear whether Abram values her sufficiently. But notice that it's Yahweh, it's God who ends up defending Sarai's honor. It's God who then sends plagues on Egypt in response to this injustice that's happening, right? And then it's Pharaoh, it's the pagan king who has to reprimand Abram. That's to say, it says to Abram, what are you doing to me? Right? Are you trying to ruin me? Are you trying to destroy? Because it's obvious to Pharaoh what's going on. These plagues have come upon my country because your God is cursing me for having taken your wife, right? Like that, this is a great injustice. You can't take someone else's wife. And he says to Abram, I almost married her. Think of how bad that would have been, right? It could have destroyed everything. So Pharaoh, even though he's a pagan, understands, right, how justice works, right, and righteousness works, right, and that if you want to be blessed by, in his mind, as a pagan, by the gods or by your God, then you need to maintain justice and this faithfulness. And so while it's not as maybe not explicit to us as modern readers here in the text, this is a pretty strong rebuke of Abram. This is Abram blowing about as bad as you can blow it. This is an act of Here Abram behaves like his father, right? He tries to sort of curry favor in a foreign land, a pagan land, from pagan rule. Of course, they believed the Pharaoh was a god, right, from one of the pagan gods, and in so doing, not only betrayed his marriage and his relationship with Sarah, but his relationship with God as well. And so this has to be corrected. So this is the second story we get about Abram. So we have here in this first chapter, as we begin, this story about Abram's great faithfulness, right? We're already setting up Abram as sort of the benchmark of faithfulness. Faithfulness is his sort of defining attribute, as St. Paul is still going to see it 2,000 years later. But we also see here in this second story that doesn't mean he's perfect. That doesn't mean he's sinless. That doesn't mean he gets everything right. That doesn't mean his faithfulness and his loyalty to God is flawless. And so that has two effects. Number one, it shows us that even though Abram is the beginning of God's plan to fix the catastrophes we've seen so far in Genesis, he's not the fulfillment of that plan. He's not there yet. Just as we saw with David. David, when we were going through the life of David, we saw is this icon of who Christ is, this image and picture of who Christ is. But his personal failings show us he is not Christ himself. He is just a shadow or an image of the one who's to come. Same thing with Abram, that it's provisional. But it also shows us that God's standard is not perfection. It is not that God can only work through someone who is perfectly righteous, right? And that it is not the fact that Abram was sinless and perfectly righteous that caused God to have this relationship with him, that caused him to call him, that caused him to issue these promises, because clearly he's not perfect. Clearly, even though there is this striking difference between him and his father, there are also some similarities between him and his father, and how they see the world. Right. But God can still work through and with Abram despite his sin. And what we're going to see now that we've seen these two elements, we've seen sort of the positive and negative of Abram's character. And we'll see these two things play out throughout his story. On the positive side, his faithfulness to God and his relationship with him. On the negative side, his tendency to be a little too clever by half, to sort of use his mind and his wits and try to work things out for himself, to protect himself, to get himself advantages, rather than trusting in God to be the one who protects and blesses him all the time. We're going to see these two elements of his character sometimes competing and conflicting with each other. When you go on in Genesis to see his descendants, Isaac and Jacob, and Jacob's sons, you see those two character traits play out in the family as the family goes forward, both the faithfulness and this sort of cleverness and sort of a trickster element of their personality. Some people weighted more toward one or the other. Isaac is probably weighted more toward the faithfulness. Jacob is definitely weighted more toward the trickster side. But these things play out, right? And so even though we've just started here and we've just had this preliminary chapter, we've already gotten a pretty good picture of who Abram is as a person. And we're now going to see how God, from here forward, as we go forward in the Bible study, we're going to see how God is going to continue to work in and with and through Abram to bring Abram closer to himself, to sort of refine Abram, to try and work out some of those bad parts and grow some of those good parts, and to help grow his understanding of who God is, all in the purpose of God wanting to completely share his life with Abram, so that ultimately, as Alex mentioned, we're going to read that Abram, or Abraham as he becomes, is God's friend. So since we have a hard cap in 15 minutes, I'll go ahead, and we're at a chapter break. I'll go ahead and end here. And if anybody has, let me see, anybody has any other questions or comments or what have you, we've got a few minutes here.
Father, I think Alex had another question from earlier. I'll ask him to unmute in case he may have had his question answered already, but I wanted to give him the chance.
Thank you. Yeah, it was way back when we were talking about this first promise of God about blessing Abraham and his seed, and through them all the nations. It occurred to me that that's kind of a stumbling block for the Jews of Christ's time, and continuing, I guess, to this day and going forward. This idea that, you know, Israel according to the flesh is what God's talking about, and if we especially see it play out in Zionism, for example, today, like if you're against the Jewish people, like God will, you know, punish you. And that's something that St. Paul really talks against, you know, where he talks about like Israel being like a tree, and, you know, parts can be cut out and parts can be grafted in. And so I was just thinking of the connection between this promise and then sort of how it's then applied in the New Testament to Israel according to the Spirit, how people are sons of Abraham, not because they're his descendants according to the flesh, like genetically, but rather according to his faith. And it's interesting that you point out this trickster aspect of him, sort of relying on his own wits and human ways of solving problem rather than reliance on God. Because like you said, it kind of shows that you don't have to be a perfect person for God to work with you. Faithfulness doesn't mean perfection. And I was wondering if you could maybe say if that's sort of thinking in the right direction, if I'm picking up what you're laying down.
Well, yeah. On the first part, there's, and we'll probably get into this as we go on. That's because, as I said, these promises get reiterated and expanded upon and nuanced and that kind of thing. But there is, suffice it to say for now, in the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD, there's a lively conversation going on about who are the children of Abraham, or the sons of Abraham, who are Abraham's seed. And Philo of Alexandria has a treatise called "On Who Inherits the Promises." Like, it's literally, that's the question, right? Who is it?
Because like you've pointed out, like Israel was mixed when they left Egypt. It wasn't all just descendants of Abraham even then.
Right. And it's very clear if you read the Old Testament that not everyone, you know, in Israel, right, most of the kings are wicked, right? The 10 tribes all get dispersed for their wickedness, right? So, you know, that alone opens up the conversation, right? Well, this promise can't be for these wicked people who, like the wicked generation who died in the wilderness. Well, clearly the promises weren't for them, even though they were, you know, Israel according to the flesh, they were wicked and died in the wilderness. So yeah, so that whole discussion is, and what St. Paul says about that is really entering into that discussion. And the reason I make that point is that a lot of times it gets characterized as, well, everybody just thought, you know, we take the modern idea of race or ethnicity and we push it back into the 1st century AD, and we say everyone just thought that it was, you know, the Jewish race, you know, that's what seed of Abraham meant. And then St. Paul comes and he does this totally different thing, like judo tosses the whole thing, turns it into a completely different idea, this radical new thing. And that's not how it was, right? There were already, first of all, they didn't have the concept of ethnicity or race as we have it today. But also, just having read the Old Testament, this question was a live one, right? What is it about you that makes you, right? Is it being circumcised? Because we're going to talk about Abram's given the sign of circumcision. We'll get to that in a few months. You know, is that it? Is it something else? What is it, right? And so St. Paul is not doing some weird thing that overturns what all the Jews thought until that time. He's entering into a discussion, and he's doing it from the perspective of, well, no, what does Genesis actually say?
Yeah, and even between Saint Paul and Saint Peter, there was that back and forth about, don't be a Judaizer. What do we do with the Gentiles?
Yeah.
To what extent? And then even the Pharisees, when they confront Christ at one point, they say, "We're sons of Abraham," and Christ said, God can raise sons of Abraham from these stones.
Yeah.
So it's definitely, it was a stumbling block, because for the Jews of that time, the Pharisees especially, they wanted a Messiah that would come and put them on top of the heap. Like they understood that promise as very much a worldly thing. Like, I'm going to bless and curse.
In part, that gets overread a little bit, in the sense that the Pharisees weren't modern people. So they didn't have like religious and political as two different categories. Right. So they would have seen it in the context of both. The thing with the Pharisees is that they believed that, they said, well, look, what sent us into exile in the first place, right? What caused all these problems was our sin. So if we can just get everyone to obey the commandments perfectly, the way we do, because they were so humble, right? The way we do, if we could get everyone to become like us, right, and follow all of our rules and keep the Torah perfectly, then the Messiah will come, right? Then God will send the Messiah to lead us out of exile, get rid of the Romans, et cetera, start the Messianic age, right? But based on that, and so that's why the Pharisees were so hostile towards sinful members of the community in Judea. It wasn't just that, oh, they're bad people and I don't like bad people. It was, they're the enemy. They're what's keeping the Roman oppression going. God is punishing us because of them, right? And so everything Christ does in terms of healing and welcoming those people and eating with those people is a direct attack on the Pharisees' whole system of belief. Not just the places where he's calling them hypocrites, right? but everything he's doing and everything he's saying, is.
Yeah, and in a way, that's the narrative that runs through the Old Testament too, because a lot of the prophets come to condemn that Pharisaic spirit, where it's like, you're offering these sacrifices to me in the temple, but that's not pleasing to me. I want you to show mercy and uphold justice. That's the real sacrifice. So the spirit of Pharisaism has really been striving against God for a long time within Israel.
Yeah.
In that sense.
Yeah, that it makes faithfulness to God just an outward obedience rather than an internal purification that then proceeds outward. It's not an individualistic thing, right, where it's just inside me, but it starts with me and then proceeds outward, right?
Yeah, and then
Seraph reminds us, right, with his famous quotation.
Yes, 1,000 around us. But then another thing too is, like, he does confront the Pharisees mainly. He's not going up against the Roman authorities. Speaking of Christ, the whole narrative of the gospel is him against the misled Jewish authorities, not him against the Roman oppressors.
Right, but he keeps talking to them because he's trying to win them back, right? He's trying to win them back over. And you notice the big criticism he has of them is not that they're wrong. He doesn't say, oh, all that law stuff is not important, forget about it, right? I'm doing away with that, right? It's not that they're wrong, it's that they're hypocrites, right? It's you tithe from mint and dill and cumin. You're sitting there with your little herb garden trimming off a tenth, right, of your herbs, so you can go and tithe them at the temple, because you have to tithe. You're going to that level of detail, but there are people starving in the street and you don't care, and just how sort of distorted that is. Let me see, there's stuff going on in the chat here now.
Thank you, Father.
It wasn't a surveillance state, right? There wasn't really a way to know for sure. So it's very likely that he may not have actively. And in general, in the ancient world, it was the head of the household who went and participated in the rituals, not like the whole house. You didn't take your family to church, right? You didn't take your family to the ziggurat, go worship the moon god. The head of the household would go there to offer sacrifices. So we know Terah was doing that, but it would have been relatively easy for Abram as his son not to actually participate. And then with the fallen angelic beings ruling regions of the earth in Genesis, and now Christ defeating them, least even still in power worship today. How is this played out with Christ's kingdom today, as opposed to Abraham? Well, these are the powers and principalities that St. Paul talks about. So they've already been judged in Christ's death and resurrection, but they are actively being driven out and cast out as we go out and go forth with the gospel. And when you read stories from the fathers, right, about them bringing the gospel to different places, you read about, St. Nicholas casting demons out of idols, right, and these places being set free. And so the city of Thessalonica, now Thessaloniki, was presided over by Aphrodite, who was a demonic spirit, and now it's Saint Demetrius. And so now in Christ's administration, this is what Christ is talking about when he says before his ascension, all power in heaven and on earth has been given to me, right? So it's been taken away from them, it's been given to Christ. And therefore, he said, to all nations and baptize them, right? Not just go to Israel, but go to all nations, because Christ has now reclaimed that power. But that happens in real time. That's what we're doing as we go out with the gospel and bring the Christian faith to places. The demons are driven out, the powers of darkness are dispersed, and we reclaim these things. And this is why we bless everything in the Orthodox Church. We bless houses, we bless cars, we bless boats. I've got the Great Book of Needs. We bless apiaries. We bless, right? You can go through. There's a blessing for just about anything that isn't totally sinful and wicked by nature. And we bless these things. We're reclaiming them, right, and dedicating them to the service of Christ, including people, including ourselves, hopefully starting with ourselves. Yeah. So we're getting close to our heart out. We're T-minus 2 minutes. So we should probably wrap up here.
Yes, thank you, Father. I think we can bring it to a close just so we don't overlap the next meeting. But thank you again for your time and for this wonderful Bible study.
My pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, Father.
Glad you're feeling better, Michael. And hopefully you'll start sounding better, because you're making everyone very sad with the way your voice sounds right now.
Yeah, I'm by your prayers, Father.
So. You've got the raspy jazz singer voice going for you, the Louis Armstrong.
Yeah, if only I could keep that. It sounds a little too good to be true for now.
Dark and mysterious.
But thank you all. Have a great rest of the evening. And sorry we had to cut this off a little bit early, but we appreciate you joining, and have a great rest of the evening.
Thank you, Michael, for organizing.
Yeah, absolutely. Good night.
Good night.